Right, rook plus 2 pawns versus rook plus 1 pawn. When we were looking at just rook plus 1 pawn versus rook, I think we ended up producing, I think it was like 12 to 15 videos, somewhere in that ballpark, of all the different sort of combinations you could get. You know, some of the basic stuff like Lucena, Philidor, Klingenhorwitz, long-sided defence, the vertical cut-offs, horizontal cut-offs, king in front of the rook's pawn, not the Vancouver defence, the Vancouver defence. I mean, it just went on and on and on. I forget how many hours, I spent waffling on about just rook and 1 pawn versus rook. And it's sort of just pretty obvious if you just think about some sort of basic maths combinatorics that when you've got rook plus 2 pawns versus rook plus 1 pawn, the the number of permutations is just orders of magnitude sort of greater, and the idea of trying to classify every single possible combination is just ridiculous. So you're sort of then more into, to stand a chance of being able to assimilate things at a global level to the point that they're useful. You're into ideas. It's impossible to learn every single combination, basically. Dvoretsky splits it into 3 sections. We've got pawns on the same side, pawns on opposite sides, pawns on the same wing, pawns on opposite wings, and then disconnected pawns, one of them passed. And this first video is going to be about pawns on the same wing. And yeah, we've just got to try and gain as many ideas, attacking ideas, defensive ideas, that will hopefully help us in our games. And it's fairly clear that this position has resulted from a game, or if it had been a study, it looks a very believable position to have had in a game. I've had many positions playing online that have ended up like this, and I'm sure I've then gone and played them very badly, and will maybe continue to do so. But let's try and stop playing them badly and try and understand how to play them well, I suppose. So, I mean, black's doing well here, obviously. 2 pawns versus 1, and those 2 pawns, well, one of them's passed, and black's going to be trying to win this. At any given stage, regardless of the, where the pawns are, it's a possibility that the 2 pawns the 2 versus 1 could just become 1. Just rook plus pawn versus rook. And obviously the attacking side's quite happy to do that if they end up in a 1 version of that, and the defending side's also very happy to do that if they end up in a drawn version of that. This particular setup looks to me like very likely you're going to get a drawn version. We've already got our king in front of, if you imagine a swap on g4, you can see that we've got our kings already in a pretty good place, and it's going to be a knight's pawn or something. So it doesn't look like a particularly clever idea here, but that's always the always something that both sides need to be on the lookout for. And so if you've got very good knowledge of rook and pawn versus rook, then that's going to be enormously helpful in all rook endings, but in particular rook plus 2 pawns versus rook plus 1 pawn. So how's black going to make progress here? Well, an obvious plan is to push this pawn and then follow it up with king h4. This h3 pawn is weak. We can see that pawn's weak. If the white king's forced down to the second rank, we're going to see a check along that second rank. We could even see the white king getting forced back to the first rank, and then it's going to be big trouble for white after that, with that h3 pawn being weak. So, what does white do against this? Well, the key in this particular position is the amount of space that exists behind these pawns. So straight away in this 1949 game, white plays rook b8. It's actually Smyslov versus Keres, so sort of a world champion to be. I don't think he was quite world champion by 1949. He's playing the white pieces, so you'd expect some pretty good moves. f4 check, king g2, rook c2 check. What would you play here as white? pause the video if you want to really have a think about it. There's only one drawing move, and it's king f3. You do not want your king being forced back to the first. You get your king cut off on that first rank, it's going to be big trouble. You know, I mean, without looking into it in detail, king h4 and king into g3, it just looks like curtains basically. So king f3, I'd say, is pretty much forced. I mean, you might have been worried about playing it because of that. You know, can't the black rook come in? So I can get my microphone to stay in the right place. You might have been worried about the black rook coming into h2, but here we see the space behind the pawn. So rook h8 check. We're going to defend our weak h3 pawn from the top of the board. King back to g6, check. That g5 pawn needs holding on to, and back to h8. And the black king can come and hit your rook, but we just go back and forth. We've got a sort of pendulum going on here. Okay, just enough space to avoid being knocked off the H file, basically. Now black's actually got a very clever move here. King f6. This is an extremely clever move. It's a waiting move, and it sets up a trap. Okay, so this trap that it sets up is absolutely a tactical shot that you should be aware of in all rook endgames. I've had it done to me in Blitz. It's extremely irritating. I've had it done to me more than once, which makes you wonder, why didn't I learn from my mistake the first time? I don't think I've ever done it to anyone else yet, so it's obviously not something I've stuck in my repertoire of tricks yet. And yeah, White would blunder the game away here with rook h5. I think what's wrong with rook h5? You know, black plays king g6, and we're back into that pendulum. Well, black plays king f5. You're like, all right, fine, I'll go back to h8. It's like, no, because black's now defending the g4 square. You've just dropped your h pawn, and it's rook and two pawns versus rook. That rook can't be taken because g4 check, take the rook, and the king is going to get to the key square. Okay, one of the three key squares. The black king is going to get to e3. That's gone. So yeah, I mean, you would, as white there, you would just have to now. Well, in fact, you can't do anything. Sorry, you're in check, so you've got to take that rook. So it's just completely lost. You think, well, that's all right. I'll now I've spotted that tactical trick. I will just I'll just move my king. Right. Where are you going to move your king? Oh. Yeah. Oh. Yeah. I think, well, I'll move my pawn. That doesn't care. That just takes it. So yeah, that was a nice little trick to be aware of. Where had I got to with that? So yeah, in this position here, do not play rook h5, but king g4 is fine. Rook g2 check, king back to f3, rook g3 check, king f2, king g6, and white can even push the h pawn here. If we see g4, rook g8 check, this black rook sort of awkwardly stuck defending its g pawn, and there's always enough space for the white rook. So king f7 or king h7. Doesn't matter which one, this white rook's just going to sort of sit on g5 quite happily. It's just a draw. There's nothing that black can do there to make progress. So we didn't need to worry after playing king f3 about rook h2. And in the game, black didn't play rook h2. Black played rook c3 check. King back to g2, rook g3 check. King h2, rook to e3. I mean, the white king came back to g2, but actually you could just play rook h8 check here and sort of transpose into the sorts of positions we've just seen. That would be absolutely fun. In fact, isn't the g pawn gone there? I suppose black can play king h5, but then you just go rook h8 check again. So yeah, rook h8 check there was maybe simpler, but in the game, king g2, king back to g6, and in the in the Differetsky Endgame manual, there's like a whole page of analysis and some different games that had reached this position where, you know, where white plays rook a8. Basically, white lets the black king into f5. I'm not going to go into them. You know, I've said many times, I think this book is brilliant, and you know, I can't cover absolutely every single little variation in every single position. Yeah, so buy the book and have a look at all those variations. Because the point is that in the game, white played rook f8, which is a clever sort of cutting off the black king from getting in the game. But it turns out that white doesn't have to play rook f8. It's still drawn after rook a8, and there's it's like a myriad of different variations to go through there. I think it was just going to be too impossible too difficult to keep track of them in a video. So yeah, rook f8, and then we saw rook e2 check, king f3, rook h2, rook h8. We saw the pendulum thing going on. King f6, careful. Your rook's on h5, so the black's threatening this at the moment, so you've got to play rook h8. Rook h1, waiting move. Although interestingly, rook h5... Oh yeah, rook h5 doesn't blunder here because black's not cutting off the white king. The rook has to be on h2 for that tactical shot to work, because the white king then has no moves. You would mess around though, wouldn't you, as black? You would just sort of try and triangulate and try and set that trap a little bit if you could. Oh, I would, definitely. King g2 after rook h1, rook off to d1, check, king g7, rook f5, check, king off to f3, and yeah, they agree to draw there. So that was a sort of a pretty well executed defensive plan, just being careful of that tactical shot. And if there's enough space behind the pawns, you've got this weak h-pawn, sure, but there was enough space behind the pawns to defend your h3 pawn from, well, h8 and h5 when the black king came back and hassled. Let's step forward to this 1985 game, which is exactly the same like pawn configuration. White has an h-pawn, black has an f and a g-pawn. And you think, well, this has got to be better for white, right? Because you're further up the board. It makes sense that, you know, these pawns have got further to travel to become queens or whatever black wants to promote them to. But remember, the way we were able to draw that previous position was because of all the space behind the black pawns, and here there isn't that space, so it's actually quite tricky to draw this. An example losing line would just be rook b6. Engine's just gone from 0.0 to -5. Oh, sorry, just got my variations mixed up. Rook b6, and yeah, black just plays f5 check. King f4, rook a8, rook b7, trying to get behind the pawns, but you can see there's not much space. King back to g3, rook a3 check. This time, if king f4, rook h3, what are you doing there? That's just gone. So you'd have to instead go to king g2, and the black rook's in, rook h7 check, king g4. That's the difference. Is that because we couldn't go to f4 this time because there wasn't enough space to protect our h-pawn from behind. I mean, this is just over. The black rook can come back. White's in big trouble there. That's at -8 now. Right, so what else do you do? One quite clever idea, although practically a pretty stupid idea, the more I think about it, is this h5 move. I mean, the point being that, you know, I mean, the engine gives this as a draw. It's like, yeah, that is a draw. And I suppose the black pawns are quite far up the board. But that's rook and 2 pawns versus rook, and it's f and h pawns. And I am purposefully avoiding that topic like the plague at the moment, because it is just too hard for me to understand. Basically, it is the most feared. It's arguably the most feared endgame in all of endgame theory. No one wants to get into this position. I saw it happen between two top players at the British Championships, and the commentators just sort of said, "Well, he stands no chance here." You know, and they were talking about a grandmaster versus a grandmaster, and they just said he stands. The person defending this just stood no chance. The pawns were a bit further down the board, but anyway, as it happens, Black doesn't have to go into that theoretically drawn, though practically won endgame. They can play g5. Rook b6. Yeah, so I mean, White just does nothing with that rook b6 move. What Black wants to do is push the f-pawn. They can't push the f-pawn because their king is pinned to their king. So just bring the rook forward. They want to drop their king back, but this check could cause hassle. Possibly there might be an h6 check there after a rook f7 block. Some sort of tactical shot there. But yeah, rook f7 to set it up. White just does nothing. I guess Black in the endgame, just do not hurry. Just do not hurry. You don't need to think about whether... I mean, king g7 is also fine, by the way, but you don't need to think about it. Just rook f7, cover your king, and then when White comes into f5 to stop the progress of that f-pawn, rook over to b7. We might see a swap of the pawns, but as I said earlier on, you know, knowledge of rook and pawn versus rook, so important. After king e4, I'm not going to check it. I've got a feeling Black's only got one winning move here. I'm completely wrong. Black's got 3 winning moves, but there's one move that I would just play immediately, and it is the best move on the theme of horizontal cutoff and rook b3. Yes, it also turns out that g4 and king... I suppose they're all the same sort of idea, aren't they? g4 or king g4 was stopping the white king getting in. But yeah, rook b3, rook f1, and yeah, you can see that we're going to block over there any checks, and pretty soon we're going to transform, possibly transform a horizontal cut. Well, you can see we've got the perfect cut, but we might end up transforming that into a vertical cutoff as well. So even that h5 idea, trying to get that theoretically drawn f and h pawns, although practically hard, maybe it's a bit more doable actually with the pawns as far back as this. I mean, it's definitely more doable than if they're further down the board. But Black doesn't even have to go into it. Black can just play g5. So rook b6, just sort of waiting, does nothing, because, you know, Black just employs this plan, and there's not enough space to come round and defend your h-pawn from behind. We've seen that. So how do you draw this? What's the trick? Well, this time the lack of space down the back has a flip side in that we have more space down the front, and crucially, it takes a long time for this f-pawn to run. So the defensive trick you're about to see wouldn't have worked in that previous game because the f-pawn would have queened in one of the variations you're about to look at. So king h3, and Black starts pushing the f-pawn. f5, rook a3, rook f7. This was actually played in the game. White just sort of waits, a few sort of waiting moves here. And here's the trick. Yeah, I'm not sure what the delay was in getting the rook to the g file, but this is the point. Okay, rook to g3. Black does a waiting move, and we just bring the rook back. We just leave the rook on the g file. So check, we might see king h2. Black's like, all right, plays a waiting move. I mean, the crucial point is that Black can't come forward with the king. That's the main trick of this defense. Okay, you don't need to defend your h-pawn with the king unless the rook comes back. And if the rook goes back, you're not cut off, so you can defend it with the king. So Black can't really make progress with the king because you just check it back to h6. Okay. At which point you'd think that black's plan is they can do something dangerous with this f pawn, and if the promotion was like on this rank, then yeah, they're going to be able to do something dangerous with that f pawn. But there's just not enough. So there's just too many squares to get through, basically, to do some damage with that f pawn. Rook d3, rook g2, and if black pushes the f pawn, let's look at it. f4. Then we've got time to do things like rook g4. Is that the only drawing move? It's not, but for example, rook g4. Rook d2 check, king g1, f3. Rook behind the f pawn, defends the f pawn, attacks the f pawn's gone. Okay, so I'm reasonably sure that if the original setup was further down the board, we ran into trouble in that variation because the f pawn had already queened, basically. It just wasn't possible in that other game, basically. So rather than f4, black played rook d6, king h3, rook f6, got the rook behind the f pawn, rook g5, and this one's quite illustrative of the whole thing as well. I mean, surely this is, you know, I mean, in this variation we'd definitely be in trouble if it wasn't, you know, all this way to go to the promotion square. King g2, f3 check, king f2. Rook f4, coming after your h-pawn. I don't care about my h-pawn. I really don't. That's just, yeah, it's just going to be a draw. I mean, black's last try is to hope you play rook takes f3, which I think would be a loss here, wouldn't it? Isn't that just a... Yeah, it's definitely a loss. There's a lost king and pawn ending. It's not even on the engine's top two losing moves, but so yeah, I mean, you could pause the video here. What does white play here, which is sort of the main trick of having the rook on the g file in the first place? So, you're not having my h-pawn. You can have my h-pawn if you want, but that is completely drawn if black takes the h-pawn, and it's completely drawn if black doesn't take the h-pawn. We'll just go back to where we started. So yeah, it's an ideas thing. This is a game from 1949. We've got a white h-pawn versus a black f and g-pawn, and the main defensive method was we've got lots of space behind the pawns, and we've got space to defend our h-pawn. We've also got this pendulum idea that the black king attacks the white rook. Just watch out for that attacking trap, that little blow. Where was it? I'm gonna find it now. When we reach this position, yeah, just watch out for that little blunder. Oops, and you cannot do anything against this tactical shot. So yeah, so that won the space behind, and then in this game, this was the starting position. There wasn't the space behind, but the trick was to get your rook onto the g file. It seemed like there's a bit of waiting around there. I'm not quite sure what the waiting around was. And yeah, the black king can't progress because the rook just checks it back to h6, or is quite happy to swap the h-pawn for the g-pawn, especially as the black king would then be cut off on the h-file. Right, next, this is swapped a little bit. We've now got a black f-pawn versus white g and h pawns. This is actually Polgar versus Short from 1993. It's black to play. It's extremely hard to sort of see the drawing maneuver here. It doesn't look like a draw. The drawing move doesn't look like... I mean, black's got a lot of drawing moves here, actually, but it doesn't look clever to allow the white king into e6, but it is a draw. If you just play something like rook b7, the white king comes into e6, rook b4, rook d7 check, king h6, king back to f5, rook b5 check, king takes f6, and then we just keep hassling the g-pawn. I mean, there's nothing white can do to defend that g-pawn other than go back and forth with the king, but they can just advance it. And it just looks like suicide to have your king thrown down the board like this. You know, we've got a king supporting a pass pawn. It just looks horrendous. But it's actually okay. G6, we can do lots of checking from the side. Keep checking from the side. The only way that white can avoid those checks is to go up the board and then come back to G7, threatening to get into H6. They can't come back this way because you'll just keep checking them all day. And yeah, they can't avoid checks on the third rank because they're going to drop their pawn, basically the sixth rank as we look at the board. Black's third rank, I suppose. But here you just play King G5. It's sort of like a bit of a tail hook thing that's going on. The black rook's checking from the side. This white rook is really, really awkwardly placed. And in fact, that G pawn's gone, hasn't it? So yeah, just like a waiting move, like Rook B7 was required. Now, understandably, Short was worried about that King E6 move and played Rook E7. It's now lost. And this is brilliant. This is like a white to play and win puzzle, if you want it. Polgar didn't know that it was a white to play and win puzzle, but yeah, I don't think she needed to be told that. She's like, some of the tactical stuff I've seen in her games is just astonishing. So I think she was very capable of seeing this was a white to play and win puzzle. You've had more than enough time to pause the video. Bosh, H6 check. If that pawn's taken, it's curtains. There's no defending that. Okay, your rook's attacked. Rook H5 checkmate is threatened. You've had it. Okay, so black cannot take that pawn. King F7. You've got to hold on to the F pawn. I mean, you can't play King H7 because then you'd get similar sorts of problems. I suppose it wouldn't be checkmate when the rook gets attacked, but you know, white would have two pawns, rook and two pawns versus rook. It looks very, very bad for black. So King F7 and G5. What's so good about that? And then Rook D8. How about that? Absolutely beautiful finish. I mean, I remember looking at this position ages and ages ago, and I spent a long time trying to. I think I was shown it originally. I think I was shown it in this position. I hadn't even done the H6 check, and it still took me a long time to find G5 followed by Rook D8. Rook D8 straight away isn't any good. It doesn't do anything because black's got this Rook E5 check. So you have to deflect the F6 pawn away and then play Rook D8. And black's got nothing against this. It's very, very nice finish to a game. Right, next. This is a game from 1994. It is black to play. What would you do here? I mean, there are only two drawing moves. One of them's actually G6, which doesn't look like a very clever move, but apparently is a draw. It's not a move I'd want to play. I think the move you should play, I think the move I would play, I'd like to think the move I would play is that. That just looks the most natural move. A move I definitely wouldn't play, I'm very surprised the player in the game did, because once again, it's a player who's a lot higher rated than I'll ever hope to be, but they played King takes F4. And it just looks crazy. It just looks so obviously a wrong move. Rook F7 check, King E5, King H5. And what does black do here? Their king cut off. We've got this G pawn. This G7 pawn's going pretty soon. Rook A6 takes on G7. I mean, at the very least, white's going to get a horizontal cutoff. Just transformed it into a vertical cutoff. I mean, there were lots of different ways to win this. But yeah, we've now got a vertical cutoff. Rook h8 played. King to e7. Just the simple g7 would be fine here. But we saw rook e1 check. King f8. King f6. Oh, it's a nice little zugzwang, this, isn't it? Rook h6. I like this next move. So just basically, your turn. How cool is that? So yeah, crazy move. King takes f4, allowing your king to sort of get shoved off the, to that, get cut off basically. So yeah, king g6, and it's a fairly simple draw. Like if white plays king g4, you just pin the f pawn to the king. We might see rook d6 check, king back to f7. White has no way to make progress there. Very simple draw. Or in this position, if white tried f5 check, just trying to force some sort of cut off, king takes f5 and then rook takes g7, you can just come down behind, and white hasn't got time to set up any kind of horizontal cutoff or vertical cutoff. I might see rook f7 check, king g6, the king's in, and it's a knight's pawn. I'm pretty sure you're going to get Philidor. You've kind of got Philidor already there. You've kind of got Philidor on the 4th rank there, haven't you? It's like you've got Philidor on the 4th rank, and this pawn's already advanced. So you just start your barrage of checks. Done. Right. Almost 100 years before, 98 years before that game. This is a game from 1896. It is black to play. I can't even see how many drawing moves there are, but there are at least 5. And black didn't play one of those 5 drawing moves. So pause the video and try and identify what is it that black needs to do here. Like what's your drawing plan? Because it's a fairly simple drawing plan that if you don't do, you've had it. So the really important thing to identify here is you cannot have the white king coming in. You've got to maintain control of that 5th rank. If the white king gets in, you're going to be dead, basically. So the engine's saying rook b5, rook c5, rook d5, king g8, perfectly fine move, and also king e8. But there's loads of other drawing moves, but not what was played in the game. And and black's now dead. We'll go through that in a sec. But yeah, king g8. How does white make progress here? If black's just sort of says you're not crossing this rank. It's also very difficult for white to swap rooks here. That looks 1 for black. It definitely at least drawn for black. Because the king needs to come and grab this pawn. It might not even be in the square. White's got to be very careful not to lose that. But it's definitely at least drawn for black if there's some sort of rook swap happens. You'd think. I suppose we could get into the situation where the f pawn's already gone and we've got an f and an h pawn, that those pawns look after themselves, and the white king can just sort of go and grab the a pawn and come back. But ignoring that, the rook swap's not really something that white can think about very realistically. So how's white going to cross that 5th rank? Well, they're not. So all right, let's cause trouble with our passed pawn. h5. And again, the engine's just screaming, don't give up that 5th rank. Just get rid of the a-pawn. Who cares about we don't need the a-pawn. Okay, we can draw this as long as we don't let the king cross that 5th rank. We've got 2 pawns versus 1. Exactly the same configuration as the short versus Polgar game, actually. Or Polgar versus short, I should say. And yeah, the f-pawn's being attacked. So defend it. Rook a7, back to the back rank. Okay. If white comes and attacks your pawn, we come and defend it. The king's not involved. We're cutting off the king. Very, very important defensive. I want to say technique, but it's a defensive sort of thing. There you go. That's a much better word. Thing. A defensive thing that's just of real importance in this particular position. And other positions as well, cutting off the attacking king is I suppose then it is a defensive technique, isn't it? So push the h-pawn. There's not really another plan. Rook c5, rook g7 check. What would you play here? Pause the video if you like. Gotta play king f8. If you put your king on h8, your f-pawn gets attacked. If you defend it with the rook, the king's in. And it's gone. Black would have to be... I think there's only stalemate tricks left after that. White would have to be careful of stalemate tricks, but that's all it would be. It would be a trick. There'd be no forced stalemate. So yeah, king f8. What does white do? How does white make progress? And they can't push the h-pawn. They drop their rook. Rook g6. Tap their rook again. They can come back to g7. Push the h-pawn. That's their other trick. But you just defend the h8 square. Okay. I mean, I guess you've given up control of the 5th rank now, but this h-pawn's gone out on a limb, and the white rook's in a silly place. So rook h6, king g7, rook h1. I mean, the white rook's now tied down to the defense of this pawn. If the white king comes forward, I guess we can just check it and disappear back up to the, we check it until it comes all the way over here and then go back up to the 8th rank. There's just no way for white to make progress. The only thing you have to be careful as black is that white doesn't push that pawn, takes, and then take your f pawn. So if white's got their king on e6, you'd have to do something about that. But I think if the white king was on e6 now, you might have trouble. You want to give your rook a bit of space for some checks, I would have thought, checking from the long side. Speaking of which, rook a8 is the next move. Anyway, so something like that would have been a really good way to draw it. Do not let that king cross the 5th rank. In the game, unfortunately, I mean, this is Shigorin versus Tarash, both names very famous in the world of openings, especially d4, d5 positions. I mean, there's also Tarash in the French as well, isn't there? Rook a1 was played, and white just pounced. You sort of check, king g6, rook f4, g-pawn got pushed. What does black do here? I mean, if rook takes h4, check, king there, check. It's coming through. Gone. Okay, so can't take the h-pawn. G-pawn taken, g-pawn retaken. And, I mean, black's problem is that their king's on the long side. I know it's a knight's pawn, but they can't get their king to g8 in time. That's gone. If they come, I mean, what do they do? Rook g4, take the a pawn, rook back to g1. It's just you're on the long side. Okay. I mean, if this was a Kling-and-Horwitz position now, we just saw in the Kling-and-Horwitz technique, this rook has just X-ray defended g5. Okay, and this is the point where you would now disappear off that way many files to start delivering checks from what would have to be like the K file or the M file or something, and the chessboard stops at H. And you can't disappear this way because your king is in the way of all those checks you need to deliver from the side. So it's just gone. In the game, rook a4 was played, excuse me, which isn't massively dissimilar to what we've just seen. Again, the king is on the long side. And it finished like this. Rook h1, king g6, check. King got checked up to g8. I mean, we've kind of got to the Lucena position. The only thing that's stopping it being the Lucena position now is this a pawn. It's a fairly irrelevant pawn. It's just not anywhere near far enough up the board to cause trouble. And king e8, stopping the white king getting out. Rook a6 played, I guess threatening rook h6. So if black tries to push this a pawn, king h7, and we're blocking checks there. You know, we can queen win the rook and then bring the rook back down. So rook h1 played, the a pawn got nabbed, and well, this is just the Lucena position now, isn't it? White finished it off like this. There you go. There's your little bridge. Come straight to g6. We've already got the bridge. Right, one final position. Just sort of seeing the time of the video now. So we're up to 40 odd minutes. So all of those positions I've just been through, they're all sort of given in the main text of this section in Dvoretsky on rook plus 2 versus rook plus 1, pawns on the same wing. Some of them feature in the tragicomedy section. The first position in particular had like a world of analysis on top of what I went through in this video. So get the book, read through it. It's tough, but yeah, it's good. I think it's my favourite book. And then there was just one exercise, which is actually from a 1993 game, or an adaptation of a 1993 game. So this is a variation that could have happened in a 1993 game. I haven't got the players, but I presume it was some pretty top players. You know, the way that all the grandmasters, they sort of get together and discuss ridiculous numbers of variations of just this one chess game. whereas we just play a chess game and sort of stick it in the engine to get clarification that, like, yeah, I did well, or no, I played it badly, and then that's it, into the bin, and we all just learn nothing again and again. Yeah, so this was an adaptation. White to play. What's the drawing plan? And incredibly, there's only one move here that draws. It really doesn't look like... I can't see anyone playing this move if they hadn't understood, and looked at, if you like, they're case studies, aren't they? That's the word for them. Case studies. So this is the 1949 game. Remember, we drew that because there's a lot of space. Particularly, there's enough space to defend the h-pawn from h8 with that rook h8, h5 pendulum. Okay. Whereas this one, there wasn't enough space behind. So our drawing method was to get the rook to the g file, so that in this position, for example, the black king can't make progress. If we had knowledge of those case studies, and the second one obviously is the relevant one here because there's not much space, we might find the drawing move, which is rook g1. It's the only drawing move. Who plays that move? It's such a weird move, isn't it? Such a strange move, but it is the only move to draw. If we saw king h2, rook a4, you defend your h-pawn, but the king's in. And you needed to be ready by now to play rook g5 check. So rook g1, let's see black go for that same idea. Rook a4, king h3. And when we can see king h5, we would go rook g5, king h6 is actually forced. Rook back to g1. Was rook g1 the best move? Well, there's all sorts of moves. We could even play king g3 there. What? Who would play king g3? We've discussed the drawing plan, and the engine's worked out that that's also a draw. God, they're beasts, aren't they? These engines, they're just unbelievable. So I mean, yeah, in this, I think rook g1 was actually played in the game. So there's one hell of a player who played that rook g1 move. Rook a8, rook g3, rook e8. So I'm just following the moves in the game now. And white just sort of just says, well, I'm on the g file. What are you doing? What's your plan? And it looks like we're going to end up in a similar sort of push the f pawn. I've got nothing else finish that we saw in the other game, in the 1985 game. Rook g2, rook f8. I mean, if the f-pawn gets pushed straight away, the king's into g4, f3, rook f2. That's sort of trivially drawn. So rook back to f8, rook g1. Then the f-pawn got pushed. King to g2, f3 check, king f2. Rook f5, rook g4, king h5. I suppose that was quite nice. The rook to the 5th rank to stop the rook g5 idea. But white, I mean, there's lots of drawing moves there, but white sort of smelt the danger and got their rook to the 4th rank and then shoved it off over there. So I guess, yeah, they're now saying, well, your king's not crossing the 4th rank. You have no way to arrange a rook swap that gets your king onto g4. Your rook's tied down to the defense of this. It's obviously a draw, isn't it? So, yeah, very well done if you found rook g1 in that position. Right, I think that's enough on pawns on the same wing. Rook +2 versus rook +1.